In this third and final part of the lecture, I want to look at how trade might be organised if the UK were outside the European Union. Now, Britain has strong trade links with markets outside the EU, as reflected in the UK trade figures we have seen before. If we look at these again now, what they show is that exports of goods to the rest of the world are greater than to the EU. The UK also has a much bigger trade surplus in services exported globally than the one it has with the EU. So there are lots of promising aspects about the UK's position in global trade. However, there are major drawbacks to operating alone in world trade. If the UK simply left the single market, it would be able to trade with the EU and elsewhere under World Trade Organization rules. While this arrangement means the UK would have a stable platform for global trade, the problem is that it would be outside the EU's common external tariff. Outside this area, imports of agricultural products, for instance, face high EU tariffs, that is, a tax surcharge, and that's shown in this image about the EU's common external tariff, which has been compiled by the WTO. So what we see here, for instance, is that for dairy products imported into the EU, there is a 45% tariff of the cost of the actual good. Imports of cars, a booming UK industry of late, face a 10% tariff. On average, the UK government puts the average import cost for goods arriving from outside the EU as 8.7%. Now, some goods would be subject to a lower tariff, and new markets could be found for British products, but there would inevitably be a lot of disruption in the short to medium term. Now, it's important to remember that we are talking about a market for roughly 50% of UK exports of goods. The other big issue relating to global trade is that WTO rules do not really cover trade and services, which is a key British strength. That is why big economies currently do their own trade deals to include such areas. At the moment, the EU has preferential trade agreements with South Korea, South Africa, Mexico, many countries around the Mediterranean, and a customs union with Turkey. It has negotiated a deal, yet to be put into practice, with Canada, and is trying to find an arrangement with India, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, in addition to the transatlantic trade and investment partnership talks being held with the US that you might be familiar with. Now, outside the EU, the UK would not be covered by any of these external trade agreements. Of course, it is not that the UK actually negotiated any of these existing deals. EU trade policy is something that requires agreement amongst member states of the EU. And as Michael Gove pointed out in the earlier video clip, it's not even the case that there is a British trade representative doing the negotiating. So the outcome of these current external trade deals might not be tailor-made for the UK economy. That means there is an opportunity, as the Leave Camp suggests, to negotiate better deals outside the EU. And this is absolutely true in principle. But in practice, trade deals are extremely complex to negotiate as there are so many business and labour interests at stake. Outside the EU, UK trade negotiators would be in a particularly tricky position as they would need to negotiate on several fronts simultaneously. That is, there would be EU-UK talks to minimise disruptions to UK exports to the single market, and at the same time, the UK government would be examining options for doing its own free trade deals outside the EU, and that's something that it can't do unilaterally today as part of the EU's common external tariff. The problem with that simultaneous negotiation is that there may be many issues on which negotiations with the EU and non-EU countries won't be complementary. That is, any deal with the EU is likely to include agreement on certain regulatory standards that will impact the terms of free trade deals with non-EU countries. In terms of a concrete example, there could well be a deal to limit tariffs on beef products if common standards between the UK and the EU could be maintained. But in turn, this would affect a US-UK agriculture deal, as American negotiators are bound to ask for the UK to accept imports of hormone-treated cattle, a form of beef production that the EU and thus the UK currently bans. Now, the UK can have one regulatory standard or the other, but it can't have both. On certain issues, therefore, British negotiators would have to choose whether it is better to gain access to the single market or to be free to do independent deals. Now, politically and economically, that's a difficult balancing act. International trade and investment are very sensitive to uncertainty, and a British withdrawal from the EU would definitely create an unprecedented rewriting of trade rules. And I think that helps explain why some of the UK's major trade partners have indicated they prefer the UK to stick with the current status quo of being inside the EU. Here's a quote from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that coincided with the state visit of President Xi in October 2015. China hopes to see a prosperous Europe and a united EU, and hopes Britain, as an important member of the EU, can play an even more positive and constructive role in promoting the deepening development of China-EU ties. I've also got here a quote from the boss of the airline company Ryanair. He's justifying his support for staying in and warning about low growth if the UK leaves the EU. His name is Michael O'Leary, and he's saying then that if the British public does vote to leave Europe in June, 3 or 4 years of uncertainty and less economic growth would follow. Now, it's not clear that this forecast is inevitable, but it's certainly something that many business figures and foreign leaders fear, and they fear it because of the difficulty of having to redesign British trade globally if you abandon the status quo. Thus, it would be very interesting to get feedback in the discussion forum this week of how worried you are about trade uncertainty in the event of Brexit and whether this affects how you might vote. So in terms of conclusions, I think the main message from examining the functioning of the single market is that leaving the EU will cause a lot of uncertainty over the UK's trade arrangements. That's not to say that staying in the EU does not also come with risks. In fact, I will be analysing those in the final lecture. Leaving the EU but staying in the single market, for instance as the EEA countries do, makes very little sense for the UK, as this arrangement entails losing sovereignty for no gain in influence. That means that crafting new trade deals after a Brexit will be essential. But there are great time constraints for doing so, because the agreed method for leaving the EU, under something called Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, is to unravel political and economic ties within 2 years, unless, that is, all remaining EU countries agree to extend the deadline, which could be very difficult for them to do. Now, that 2-year period is an extremely short period to arrange some kind of access to the single market and to replace the 53 external trade deals that the UK currently has via its EU membership. But of course, trade and economic benefits are not the only factors citizens have in mind when pondering the UK's future. Security and the kind of society we live in are also essential concerns. These issues are inextricably linked to the principle of the free movement of people, which is a core freedom of the European Union. That's why the topic I explore in next week's lecture is immigration and border control.